Taking a look at the White House over in Washington, D.C., President Trump is set to leave for Beijing today to meet with President Xi Jinping just weeks after trying and failing to persuade the Chinese government to use its considerable leverage to prod Iran to agree to U.S. terms to end the two-month-old war, or at the very least reopen the critical Strait of Hormuz. The Associated Press goes on to say that President Trump has veered between venting that China, the world's biggest buyer of Iranian oil, hasn't done more to get the Islamic Republic in line, and acknowledging that Xi's government helped de-escalate the conflict last month by nudging Tehran back to ceasefire talks when negotiations wobbled. But ahead of this high-stakes meeting, the White House has set low expectations that the president will be able to persuade Xi to change China's posture. Continuing on here with some more of this as we look ahead again to this historic meeting. Joining us next onto the program is Wendy Cutler. She's the Senior Vice President at the Asia Policy Institute, and she joins us this morning. Wendy, good to see you. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It is a very exciting time, waiting to see what both world leaders are going to discuss. So let's just do a breakdown and an overview for our viewers here. What objectives are both presidents bringing to the table here, and where are they at odds at the moment?
So look, both leaders have a shared objective of continuing a stabilization path in the relationship. Now, they both want it for different reasons. I think they're both using this period to become less dependent on each other, in particularly in sensitive products. But there are some issues of potential friction, and that includes what the U.S. asks China to do with respect to the Iran conflict. And China is going to be looking for the U.S. to kind of soften its position on Taiwan. So these are the two kind of key issues to watch. And particularly, I think what worries a lot of viewers and observers is that there'll be some kind of trade-off between the two.
And we're going to talk a little more in depth about these two specific issues, Iran, also Taiwan, and then trade. But before we get into that, a little background context here, Wendy, as well. What makes this meeting particularly different from past meetings that President Trump has had with the Chinese president?
Well, look, this is the first visit by any U.S. president, and that was Trump about 9 years ago. So the fact he's going to Beijing, I think, is extremely important. But also, look, we're in a world now with a lot of conflicts, a lot of different coalitions of countries working together, and a real feeling that the current global order is behind us and we need to put together a new one, with China very much on the forefront. So again, I think there are areas where the two sides can work together, or at least stabilize the relationship and keep in communication. I would also just note that this meeting could be the first of 4 face-to-face meetings between the two leaders this year, which means that the personal chemistry that we can observe in this meeting could be very important going forward this year.
I had read some reportings that there's probably plans for President Xi to come to the United States as well. So yes, we're waiting to see some more of those face-to-face meetings. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty on these specific topics. So taking a look at a social media post here, courtesy of Fox News, it says, new President Trump prepares for a high-stakes summit with President Xi, signaling that the future of U.S. weapons sales to Taiwan is on the negotiating table. Quote, I'm going to have that discussion with President Xi. President Xi would like us not to, and I'll have that discussion. That's one of the many things I'll be talking about. He and I have gotten along well. He runs 1.4 billion people with a pretty iron fist. He loves his country, I can tell you that. It is a direct quote from President Trump as he was speaking to reporters, and how he's talked about this upcoming meeting. So Wendy, Taiwan, again, most likely going to be discussed during this. What specific concessions or assurances might Beijing seek from Washington during these talks and vice versa?
Look, there are really 2 core asks that China could present to the president. Number 1 would either to cancel or delay these arms shipments that you just mentioned. But the second is trying to soften this language that the U.S. traditionally has used for many, many years to describe its relationship with Taiwan. And if this language is softened, that does kind of send a signal to Taiwan that U.S. strong U.S. support for Taiwan may be waning as the U.S. seeks better relations for China. We'll see what the president does. Obviously, there's some competing things going on inside him. On one hand, he very much wants to have a good meeting with Xi and he respects Xi. On the other hand, I think he fully understands the U.S. security positions and why we are where we are with Taiwan.
Is it possible for President Trump to have that successful conversation with President Xi and strengthening that alliance while also keeping that support for Taiwan? Or what would that do to the geopolitical structure in the area?
Well, look, if he signals a softening in his position on Taiwan or agrees to delay those shipments, that is going to send a chill not only to Taiwan, but to many in our Congress as well, and many Taiwan supporters around the world. So, again, we'll have to see how he navigates through these asks. And let's remember, there are 4 meetings this year. So Beijing could put an ask on the table. He doesn't respond in a positive way, but maybe 3 meetings from now, later in the year, this ask looks like something that is more attractive to him.
And what kind of indicators are you going to be watching out for to see if after this meeting, some of the stance with Taiwan and the U.S. has materially shifted?
Well, I think the obvious indication will be what happens to those arms shipments. Does he instruct the U.S. to slow those down or to cancel them? But I think that will be the most immediate sign following this meeting.
I want to also talk a little bit about trade before we get to Iran. Obviously, the U.S. and China have been going back and forth when it comes to trade, when it comes to tariffs. So what are some of the hardest compromises for both countries to get to economically?
So look, both sides seem to be teeing up this creation of what's called a board of trade. And this board of trade would consist of officials from both countries to manage trade in non-sensitive sectors. So what are non-sensitive sectors? Agriculture, toys, low-end electronics. And I think the goal is to try and keep that trade flowing, maybe by even lowering tariffs for those products, while keeping off the table trade in these sensitive areas, including semiconductors, semiconductor equipment, and critical minerals and magnets.
How much trust exists between both of these governments when it comes to enforcing some of these trade understandings?
Not enough trust, frankly, and trust is very important. Again, I think you make an excellent point. It's not just what they announce, but it's how these agreements or announcements will be actually implemented. And there was some strong disappointment during Trump 1.0 when he was able to secure from China a $200 billion commitment of additional purchases of U.S. goods, a commitment that China never fulfilled. So I think that is in the back of the president's mind and his team's mind as they enter into any agreements or welcome any announcements emanating from this meeting.
Is there anything else that you would like to add about maybe these trade or economic talks that both leaders are going to have before we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, I would just say I think it's good news that Secretary Bess and USTR Greer are meeting with their Chinese counterpart in advance of this meeting. My understanding is they'll be meeting in Korea tomorrow. I think that will help them kind of finalize and tee up these deliverables and try and get rid of any disagreements on some of these deliverables to pave the way for a smoother meeting between the leaders. The other point I would just raise is that the issue of Chinese investment in the United States may come up as well. And there are really differing views on whether we should welcome Chinese investment into the U.S. or are these investments really a threat and something that's not in our interest? And I don't think there's any consensus in Congress or in the administration on how to deal with investment. So we may just see some really general comments on investment with the two sides agreeing to look into prospects for some limited deals in the coming year.
I'm really glad, Wendy, that you mentioned this visit from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier today. These are some of the images that we had here him and the Japanese Prime Minister. So I'm glad we touched on that a little bit. Again, there's so much to get to within this particular topic, so some things can get lost in the conversation. But again, those were the images we had today. So a lot of moving parts, at least within that region of the world, and some of this U.S. involvement, so to speak. All right, let's turn to one of the major global conflicts we have been following lately. The situation with Iran, the war that continues there, the disruptions at the Strait of Hormuz. Set the scene for us here. The kind of impacts that China has been facing because of that war and how it compares to what the U.S. is facing.
So for China, you really need to look at the immediate term versus the longer term. And in the immediate term, China has done a lot to build up its economic security. It has successfully moved to green technologies. It has stockpiled unprecedented amounts of oil, and it has kind of strengthened its coal production. So it was pretty well positioned to weather the storm, the immediate storm from the shutdown of the Gulf of Hormuz. Because keep in mind that China does get some of its oil and energy from Iran, but also more broadly from the Middle East. What I think, though, is happening in China is that as this war continues, it's recognizing that it needs more security and would very much like to see the Gulf of Hormuz be reopened. So I think the U.S. and China have a common shared objective with respect to opening the strait. Where their positions differ, though, however, is that the U.S. would very much like China to tell Iran, enough's enough, you need to come to the peace table and make concessions. And I think that is a bridge way too far for China. But the U.S. may ask Xi Jinping to use his good offices to persuade Iran to be more accommodating.
Is it possible that within this talk also between both presidents, they're going to be discussing the war between Russia and Ukraine?
I think it will come up, but frankly, I think it's going to be crowded out by all of these other issues. Remember, just a few months ago when this meeting was scheduled, the Iran conflict wasn't even on the agenda. And the feeling was there was so much to talk about on trade and investment and AI and health and other issues. And so now you have kind of the Iran issue crowding out some of these other issues. And so I think the Ukraine-Russia situation probably will be mentioned, but will it get the time and bandwidth of discussion that it needs? Probably not.
Wendy, what would be a successful outcome for both Washington and Beijing after this meeting?
I think what I'm looking for is what they say about stabilization. Are both sides committed to that? And remember, there was a trade truce reached last October, and I'll be watching carefully to see if both sides announce that they want to roll over this extension beyond October. I think that would be a positive sign. And of course, we'll need to look very carefully at the deliverables on trade, investment, Taiwan, Iran, et cetera. And so looking at each side's comments and announcements after the meeting will be extremely important. We'll get signals on how they prioritize the outcomes of this meeting and which issues they're pointing to as a success. And it's very possible, for example, that China won't even announce certain things that the U.S. announces. They'll want to just kind of, have those announcements not be really public. And so, the outcomes will have to look very carefully and kind of parse through what each side is saying and where they put their emphasis.
Well, Wendy, we covered a lot of ground here. Like you mentioned, a lot of details to get to within this meeting. So many topics that both are set to discuss. Is there anything else you feel that you may have to add that we didn't discuss here before I let you go?
Again, I would just say we should look at that personal chemistry, because personal chemistry between two leaders like this who are very strong and really play decisive roles in their bureaucracies is going to be very important going forward to manage conflicts, but also to find areas of cooperation. And so one area we haven't gotten to, but I think, we may see some type of announcement, is a new dialogue on artificial intelligence, and in particular, the appropriate use of AI. I think this is an area ripe for discussions and maybe even cooperation going forward.
Wendy Cutler, Senior Vice President at the Asia Policy Society Institute. Thanks so much for joining us here at Live Now from Fox. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, we are going to step away for a quick commercial break, but still tracking some more of the day's top stories and headlines from across the country. Stay with us.